Good morning. We will begin the development of our application in RunMyProcess with three fundamental stages. In step 1, we will carry out the definition of user stories, delving into the needs and expectations of our users to establish a solid foundation. In step 2, we will configure the workflow and design in RunMyProcess, applying what we have learned to build and shape the application, ensuring that it aligns with the user stories defined earlier. And finally, we will launch our application in test mode, generating a report and ensuring that each component and step of our application is functioning correctly. So let's get started. So this is the development environment of RunMyProcess. So the first step when you want to build an application is to create the group roles that are going to be involved inside this application. So from the user stories that we have seen, we detected three main roles that will be the employee, who will make the request, the manager, who will approve the request, and finally the developers who are going to build the application. So let's start by creating the organization. So I'm going to log in into the platform. And now, after logging in, normally you should be redirected to the home page. So this is the Digital Suite Studio. This is the development environment of RunMyProcess that is 100% cloud-based. So in this development environment, as we said initially, we are going to start by creating our organization. So I'm going to create a new organization that I will call February 2024 budget approval. In this case, I put Feb just because I wanted to keep in mind that this is a budget approval application that I'm building in February. So this is the budget approval application for all the organization. So after that, I can save my organization. So basically, the organization is the container of the roles. So now I'm going to define the different roles that are going to be involved in this project. So as you can see now, I have my organization at the top, and now I can click on the action and add new role. So the first role that we usually add to any application is the developer role, which is the group of the people who are going to have the possibility to update, to build this application. So in this developer role, so I'm going to create it as a static role, and I will have the possibility to add users. So I will add the RunMyProcess University user as a developer. Then I can save. Then similarly, I will create all the other roles. So I will again add action, add a new role. I will create the employee role, and I have the possibility to say that the employee role is an everybody role, which means that this role contains all the employees of the organization. I can save. And finally, after the employee role, we can create our manager role. So the manager is going to be basically the role containing the people who are going to review the budget request coming from the employee. So I can create it again as a static role and add some users. So I'm going to click on the plus and I'm going to add again the university user as I'm going to add the university user as a user. After that, I can save. Perfect. So now we have created our organization and the three roles of our organization. These three roles, if you remember, have been identified from the user stories that we got as a requirement. So as you can see, we identified three roles. One is the employee, the other one is the manager, and then we have the developer who is going to build the application. So let's go into the web interface tab and let's create a web interface that I'm going to call main, because this is our main form, budget approval request. Then we can click on create. And as you can see, we have just created our application. So now what you are seeing is the low-code environment of RunMyProcess where you can configure your web interface. So this is going to be a simple web interface where we will simply ask the employee to provide the amount that he needs, maybe a justification, some attachment if he needs, and that's it. So we also have the possibility, for example, to configure the header of the web page that we are designing. So for example, we can add an header title that I will call here budget request form. After that, we can start adding the different components in the web interface. So I'm going to click on the widget tabs. I will be able, for example, to add some components that are called the containers, where you can have some sections. So I'm going to add a section, for example, where I will ask the employee to provide the employee information. Then I can add a second section where I will ask, for example, to provide the budget information. So now, after this, we can add some fields. So for example, I'm going to add, for the employee information, I'm going to ask him to specify his name. I can again also ask him, for example, to specify his email. And so on and so on. We can ask him, for example, to specify his department. What is really important here is that you can customize the fields that you need and so on and so on. You can ask him also to specify, for example, his hire date. Of course, if you connect your RunMyProcess application to an Active Directory, for example, this is possible. You can automatically get this information from the Active Directory. We will see later in another tutorial how to implement this kind of functionality. So now let's jump into the budget information. So regarding the budget information, what is necessary, first of all, is to put a number and ask the amount that you are requesting. And after asking the amount, we can also ask you to provide a business justification. And the business justification can be a field that you can put in multiple lines. So I can say, for example, that
The business justification field can be in 5 lines. And finally, I will add another section that is going to be what we are calling the history and attachment section. So this section will contain the history. The history is a very useful widget when you want to track all the different actions that are performed in a given request. So I'm going to add the application history, and I will also add a file upload component where I will say you can add any documents that you want to attach to your request. I can save. At this step, we have just finished the configuration of our request form. So we have the possibility by clicking on Run the Web Interface to visualize our web interface in test mode. And this is how our web interface looks like in test mode. So that was the first step. So now we have the interface. This is the interface that the employee is going to use to request the budget. Then, as we know, the manager will also need a view on this interface in order to be able to approve or reject the request. So how are we going to create this view? So we are going back to our RunMyProcess configuration, interface configuration. We are going to click on the screens. So the screens are basically the different views that we are creating on a web interface. So we are going to create also one view for the manager that we are going to call manager. And what we are going to do now is that for this view, the manager view that I have just selected, we are going to say that the manager can visualize all the information, but he cannot edit this information. So when I select the section, for example, containing the employee information, I'm going to uncheck the editable functionality of this section. So all the information that are inside the section are not going to be editable. And I will do the same thing for all the other sections. So the manager cannot modify what has been provided by the employee initially. I can save. Now that we have the web interface with the different views, so what is left now is that, let me just check again, because in the launch, I want it to be editable, so the employee can provide the information. And just for the manager, it should not be editable. So now we have our interface. What is left is the process. So the process basically is the business logic. What do you want to do after the employee submits this report? Then I'm going to click on processes, and we are going to click on create processes. So again, I'm going to say this is my main process, that is the budget approval. So for the main process as well, the first question is that we need to specify what is the process initiation role. So for the process initiation role, basically, the question we need to answer is who can make a budget approval request? And the answer is all the employees. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to take my organization again. So my 2024 budget approval, and I will select the role employee. And these are the people who can make a new budget request. So after that, then what we have to do is that we have to configure this process, that is a low-code process configurator. So what we are going to do is that we need to decide what happens after the employee submits the form. So the start event means the form has been submitted. So I'm going to add a role, and the role that I will add now is the manager, because after the employee submits, I would like the manager to approve or reject the budget request. And after the manager approve or rejects the request, we are going to add a gateway. We need to be specific in the gateway. So I'm going to, this one, the gateway that I want to add is going to be a split exclusive gateway, because the two conditions that I will have as output are exclusive condition. Or I approve or I reject. I cannot do both. So if I approve, then I will notify for the approval. And if I reject, similarly, I will notify rejection. And as you know, best practice BPM, every time you have a split, you should also have a join. So at the end of these two steps, I will also add a join exclusive or, and this join basically is going to close my two conditions, and then I can close my workflow. So now let's configure step by step this process. The first step about the approval or the rejection is going to be what we are calling a manual activity. So manual means there's going to be a human interaction. And for this manual activity, I'm going to select my web interface, and the screen that I will select is going to be the manager view that I created previously. I can save. And finally, what I have to do is to configure the gateway and the two notifications. So this is going to be the last step that we will do. So in order to configure the two notifications, what we need is to use the mail provider that is provided by default by RunMyProcess. To use this mail provider, I'm going back to the settings, then subproject, and then I will add a subproject. I can search for mail provider. So this is the mail server that RunMyProcess is providing by default to all the customers. I will select the mail provider, and the mail provider is automatically added to my project. So if I go back to the process now, I select the approval. So I will say this is going to be an email notification. The recipient of this email is going to be an internal parameter called p_initiator.login. So I'm notifying the initiator of the process. So I'm going to say budget approved is going to be an email notification. Then I can select the provider in the subproject, default mail provider. And finally, I can say in the message, good morning, your budget request has been approved. That's, and for the rejection, so this is gonna be, if I double click approve, if I double click, this is gonna be rejected. For the rejection as well, we will say this is an email notification. Again, I'm going to notify the initiator. The subject is going to be this time budget request rejected. Is gonna be an email notification. Again, I'm gonna attach the provider. Message is going to be good morning. Your budget request has been rejected. Regards. Okay, so we have just configured the two notifications. Now, the last thing to configure is the split gateway, where we should have a condition. So in order to configure the split gateway, we need to link our business logic, so our process, with the interface that we built previously. Always check, please, when you build something that you are saving. So in order to connect both, so I'm going to select first of all the launch screen, and in the widget, I will add a button to my interface, a submit button at the bottom. So when I add the submit button, automatically I have this pop-up where I can select the process. So which means that from this screen, when the user click on submit, I will trigger the process that we have just created. Similarly, for the manager, I will select the manager and I will add two buttons, one for the approval and one for the rejection. So one is going to be approve and the other one is going to be reject. So for the approval, I will add a value. If it's approved, I will just say that my variable approved is going to be yes. And if it's rejected, similarly, my variable reject is gonna be yes. So now we have two variables that are going to tell us which gateway path our process should follow when the manager approves or rejects. I can save. So let's go back to the process now and we can configure our last step. So my request is approved if the, so I'm going to select the marker. If my approve variable default, because if the user doesn't click on it, it's gonna be empty. So default empty equals yes. So this is the condition that we want the flow to follow the approve path, and it's gonna be rejected. So for the rejection, again, we are going to configure, is gonna be the default path. So if it's not approved, by default, I will say it's rejected. Okay, so we have just finished with the configuration of our process. We have also configured our web interface correctly. We were able to test our web interface. Finally, what we need to do, we are going to jump into the last section of this training. We are going to test the application. So let's launch our application. So now we have the application with the submit button. So I can provide all the information like Paul, Edward. I can provide the email paul.edwards@akabi.com. You can specify the department, sales, the hire date. You can specify the amount like $2,000, $20,000. The business justification. This is urgent. Finally, if you want, you can attach some document and you can submit the request. As you can see, the request has been registered. So now, how are we gonna track the request that has been submitted? So in order to see how our request is executing, we are going back to our project web interface. We are going to select the report tab, and we are going to create a new process report. So since we are still in development mode, I will select test as the mode that I am using for this report. And I will say I want to execute this report for my main budget approval process. So when I click on process, then I select budget approval, and I can finally run the report. And you can see I have one request that I started that is waiting. So if I click, then I can visualize the execution of my process. So this is the submit that is green, and now we have the waiting stage that is here. I can click to open the form corresponding to this waiting activity. And this is basically the form. As you can see, I cannot modify any of the information, but I can visualize them. And my history is telling me when this request was created, the user that created the request. And finally, I can approve or reject the request. So let's approve this time. So after approve, I have a small pop-up message. And if we go back to the process report now, if we go back to the process report and we refresh, we see that our process has been executed successfully. The approval has been done, and our workflow is working as needed. So this is how in more or less 10 minutes, you can create a RunMyProcess application. Thank you for following us. If you have any question, do not hesitate to contact us in our support community forum. Thank you.